The International Association of Oral and Maxillofacial Surgeons is pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Leading Change, Flourishing in the 21st Century. My name is Sandy, and it's my pleasure to be the facilitator for today's event. I'd like to formally welcome the participants who are joining us today. Please note that today's call is being recorded and all participant lines will be muted during this broadcast. If you experience technical difficulties with the web portion of today's program, please email IAOMS@compartners.com or send a message in the chat box. If you are listening to the program over the phone and you need assistance at any time, please press *0 and an operator will assist you. This presentation will last up to 60 minutes and will include question and answer opportunities at the end. However, you may submit a question at any time by typing into the chat box at the lower left corner of the screen and clicking on the send button. I'd like to direct your attention to the links box located to the left of the screen where presentation slides are located for you to view, save, or print. Simply click on the link of your choice and a separate web browser window will open. This will not interfere with your viewing of the program. It's now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to Deborah Zabladil, who will introduce today's speaker. Deborah?
Thank you so much, Sandy. Welcome, IAOMS community throughout the world. My name is Deborah Zabladil, and I'm working with IAOMS on its education efforts, including the webinar series you are on today. IAOMS launched the Next Level Forum Digital series this summer as a continuation of the Next Level Forum concept introduced at ICOMS in Hong Kong. Through these professional development webinars, our goal is to help IAOMS members advance their career and the OMS specialty by exploring issues and best practices related to leadership and management. While today's webinar is open to members and non-members, Next Level Forum Digital is a new benefit for IAOMS members, and subsequent webinars will be available only to IAOMS members. If you'd like to join or renew your membership, please visit IAOMS.org. And watch for details on our upcoming webinars, including the December 1st webinar, which will focus on mindfulness. Now on to our presenter. John Sena is the former Executive Vice President of Healthcare Research Systems in Columbus, Ohio, a medical outcomes measurement and marketing firm. A successful author and lecturer, Dr. Sena received 3 university-wide awards for outstanding teaching at The Ohio State University, as well as the university's Distinguished Affirmative Action Award. Dr. Sena is a frequent lecturer on emerging trends in healthcare, change management, and leadership skills. John speaks and writes frequently for healthcare and medical societies and groups around the globe. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Sena.
Oh, thank you, Deborah, for those kind words. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar on leading change. Obviously, healthcare is changing at a prodigious rate these days, and I hope this webinar helps you in managing your own change and implementing your own changes. The ideas and principles I'm going to talk about are generic enough that they should apply to you regardless of where you are working or living. And I'd like to start with my first slide, which is that change is the norm. Change is not something we do intermittently. It's not something we do now and then. It's what we do all the time. And I think one of the most important things is to convince your employees that change is good. Sometimes they have a negative view of it, but without change, we can't improve our skills, we can't grow professionally, we can't deliver better quality of care, we can't deliver better patient satisfaction. That change is inherently a good thing, but that we realize it's difficult. It's a lot easier to keep the status quo. Believe me, we're all comfortable with the status quo. There's no threat to the status quo. So change is difficult. And in some organizations that I've seen, it leads to a cult of victimization, where I'll hear managers say, what changes are they making me jump through now? What are they making me do now? The they is often unspecified. But I think that kind of learned helplessness is contagious in an organization, and if the leader of a change isn't absolutely convinced that this change is necessary, employees can see through us like we're cellophane. They'll realize that you're not serious about it or that you're half-hearted about it, and that becomes contagious in a department, and then often the change will fail. We must be proactive in our changes. Now, I know all of you are proactive, but I think one of the criticisms of healthcare in general has been that we tend to be reactive. We tend to wait for the next regulatory decision to land on our doorstep, and then we scurry about trying to administer it. Leading change is all about the future. A change leader is someone who is a futurist, who's thinking about what will the needs of my patients, my practice, my community be a year from now, 2 years from now. How are the demographics of my community changing? That is, it's a person who keeps his eye on the future. Now, change is not linear. We, at least not in my model, we in Western society always like to talk about flow charts as being linear. You go from A, straight line to B, straight line to C, and that's the end. I don't like that model for change because it implies there's a definite sort of concretization of it, that it ends and it's over. In reality, I think once a change has been effectuated, has been implemented, in a little while, people start to tweak that too. So I like to use the metaphor of a circle that picks up the dynamic nature of change, that even when the change is completed, we still go on from there to another change. And there's one bullet that is missing on this slide, and that is the psychological side of change. Your employees are not computers. I mean, they're people, and they have emotions and feelings, and the psychological side of change is vitally important. It's almost as important as the operational side, because if people aren't on board, if they don't totally believe in this, and remember, you can get people to comply with your wishes because you can fire them, but we want them to become committed, to feel the need for this change in their bones, and to be accepting of that, not to be fearful of it. If you don't address the psychological side of it, the change won't be as robust as it would have been. It might not even work. Please do this for me, just as an experiment. Please fold your hands as you would if you were going to pray. That is, intertwine your fingers and put whatever thumb normally goes on top. So if you're going to go to a church or a mosque or a synagogue or a temple, fold your hands like that for a moment or two, okay? Okay, now I want you to refold your hands with the other thumb on top. And how does it feel? A little awkward? Physically awkward? Don't like it? You feel a little antsy because it's not comfortable? Well, okay, you don't have to do that anymore. You can unfold your hands. What I wanted to suggest by that is I asked you to do a very simple change. I can't think of anything simpler than how we fold our hands. And you didn't like it. Because I asked you to leave your comfort zone just for a few seconds, and you didn't like it and couldn't wait to get back to your comfort zone. How much more so with somebody who's been doing a project or doing his job for 5 years, and we ask the person to change, and then we get all bent out of shape because the person doesn't immediately change. And that's what I mean about the psychological side to it. It is a vital, important part of the change process. Now, some characteristics of the change leader. First of all, embrace ambiguity. I know we don't like ambiguity in our lives. I like to know what's going to happen. Even if what's going to happen is bad, I can adjust to it. Change is all about ambiguity. You don't really know if the change is going to work. We're stretching out into new ground. Maybe the change will be smaller than you thought. Maybe employees will redefine it in a different direction. Maybe it will go off on a tangent, which can be good or bad. That is, there's a lot of ambiguity in the change process, and that's why the change leader has to be aware of that and to embrace it. And then know yourself. That's the first rule of education laid down by Socrates 2,000 years ago. Know your limitations. Know what you do well and what you don't do well. Now, I think it's very hard for one individual to be so well-versed in all aspects of change in this complex healthcare world that we live in that one person can do this without any assistance. You might be very good in most aspects of leading change, except you're weak in finance. Well, then ask somebody who's better in finance, who's an expert in finance, to help you out on that, to help you out on cash flow or budgeting. It's not a sign of weakness to ask for help. I think it's a sign of weakness not to ask for help. And then I'd like you to be, when we're planning for change, a reasonable risk taker. Now, the operative word there is reasonable. I don't want you to put your organization in jeopardy. But, healthcare obviously is changing at an incredible pace. I mean, outside of the computer industry, I can't think of any part of the corporate world that is changing as quickly as we are. And I think sometimes our old paradigms will do. I think increasingly our old paradigms will not do. I think we're going to have to think in new terms because of the changing world we live in, because of the changing technology. So I think what I'd like us to do is when we're thinking about change, or thinking about what to do, thinking about our plan, to be creative, to be imaginative, to look at something maybe that hasn't been tried before. The usual way in healthcare is, we look at how things have been done in the past, what's our tradition, what's our custom. Well, and sometimes that's fine. Sometimes that works. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. But I would like us at least to take the opportunity to become a little more imaginative, a little more innovative in our thinking. And be adaptive. I mean, successful people, successful organizations are ones that adapt. In leading change, nothing is written in stone. You might be in the middle of the change and then suddenly decide that you're going to change something. Well, that's okay. Be able to create a sense of urgency. This is kind of an interesting point. There's a man named John Kotter, Kotter, who started this field of change management, change leadership in the 1990s. He still has an endowed chair at Harvard, and he has written voluminously on change leadership. At one point he said, if he had to think of one reason why a change program will work, he said it's that. Create a sense of urgency. That is, tell your employees, tell the people who are going to be affected by this, tell your change committee, we really have waited maybe too long for this change. It's really important that we do it now. This is the way the world we live in is functioning. We absolutely can't wait any longer to try to create that sense of urgency so that people will feel this really is necessary. Then be a great communicator. I mean, if the first rules of real estate are location, 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 the rules of change leadership are communicate, communicate, communicate. Communicate a great deal. Communication isn't just a one activity. It's a process. Communicate anytime you think there's a need to communicate. And communication is a two-way street, don't forget. You want your employees, the people experiencing this change, to communicate back to you. The Japanese have had a great deal of success having grassroots groups in the automobile industry making suggestions about quality control and quality improvement that even PhD automotive engineers hadn't thought of. So oftentimes, the people who are in the trenches doing their jobs know how to do their jobs better than you know how to do their jobs. And if they will offer you some ideas, some tweaking, please let's be receptive to that and communicate with them. Then, of course, be open and honest. People will follow a leader who says what he means and means what he says, who has integrity, who doesn't engage in corporate speak, who doesn't make promises he or she can't keep, who says something is going to be easy, a piece of cake, and it turns out to be very hard. Give people realistic change previews. Tell them it's going to be hard. I mean, don't tell you, oh, this is a walk in the park if it's not going to be. And no change that I know of is a walk in the park. Lastly, on these characteristics, listen actively. I'm convinced that we could remove a lot of the chaos in the workplace if we would listen better. Please do this for me, just as an experiment. Count from 10 to 1 backwards in your mind. Again, I'll repeat it. In your own mind, just count from 10 to 1 backwards. Now, if you said 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, that's incorrect. I want you to listen to what I said. Count from 10 to 1 backwards. 10 to 1 backwards is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, correct? That is, if you didn't get it correctly, you heard what you thought you were going to hear. not what actually was said. And I think that often happens when we're talking to employees, that we're sort of half listening, and we know this employee, know the reputation, we know the person is going to say this or that. Please listen actively. And later on in the presentation, I have 2 slides about listening better, and I'm not going to read them to you because they're fairly self-evident. But I think that's an important part of the change process. Remember, communication is a two-way street, you to the employees to you. Okay. Now, here's my model for the change process. I have 6 stages of the change process. Please think of them as being on a clock. The first is scanning and anticipation, looking to the future. Remember, change leadership is about the future. I want you to think about what the needs of your patients will be a year from now, 2 years from now. How is healthcare changing in your neck of the woods a year from now, 2 years from now? You know, your employees are not doing this. I mean, they're living from day to day. They're depending on you as their leader to be thinking about the future so that we can prepare for the future and it doesn't really suddenly just crash in on us. Okay, so let's say you've done that. Now you know what the change is that you want to implement. Now you have to get buy-in from people who are above you and below you. And we'll talk about that, and that's part of the psychological side of it, too, to get buy-in. And again, we were aiming at commitment, not just compliance. Then formulating a plan for change. We'll talk about that. Then overcoming resistance to change, and that's part of the psychological part again. Blue-collar workers, white-collar workers, and no-collar workers, people resist change. It's almost in our DNA. So we'll have a little section on that of how to overcome that resistance. Then finally, implementation of the change, and that's where the rubber meets the road. I mean, that is the point at which you can tell, well, did I do good planning? Did I overcome the resistance? And that is not the time to take a 2-week vacation either. Evaluation of the change, then finally, well, how did it work out? Did it achieve more than I wanted it to? Did it achieve less than I wanted it to? Did it change in a little direction that I hadn't anticipated? And that is fine. But it is good to evaluate at the end. Did we save time? Did we save money with this change? And let me add another one that isn't on your screen, and it's just from my own experience that change often takes longer and costs more than you anticipated. And it's just the nature of the beast. I mean, it takes longer because you're dealing with people, and they work at their own pace, and you're going to be impatient with them sometimes. And it just ends up being a little more than you planned for. So, okay. Now here's our first section is of that model of scanning and anticipation. How do we do this? Many ways of doing it. One is networking, of going to meetings that are national meetings or regional meetings where you can talk to people who maybe have effectuated this change that you're thinking about doing, and you can learn from them, find out how it worked for them, how they overcame resistance. Just get ideas from them. I often find at meetings I get more out of having coffee and talking to participants than listening to some of the papers. Then examine similar organizations and the changes they're experiencing. Take the silo away from healthcare. It's easy to say, well, healthcare is different from the rest of corporate America. That's true in some respects, but also it's true that healthcare is not different. And I think, for instance, we can learn from what other organizations are doing. Let's say look at a luxury hotel. How are they registering people? Is there something there for you registering patients? Look at what an excellent restaurant does in terms of customer satisfaction. Is any of this adaptable to what you do? Look at a company that is high on technology, that uses a great deal of communication technology, for instance. Well, is there something that is applicable to us? And I think that real creative thinking is just that. It's not thinking of something that's never been done before, but rather taking a model from another industry and seeing where it applies to what you're doing. Then create a futures task force. This is sort of fun. There are people that all of us employ who think about the future. And let's say an IT person who thinks about where we're going to be in 5 years. Maybe an HR person, a clinical person, but people who enjoy thinking about the evolution of healthcare. and have them make reports maybe once a month or once every 2 months to the organization about changes that they foresee in the future, or at least changes that are happening in the profession, so that everyone gets a sense then of organizational change, of organizational direction. It just doesn't come then out of the blue. We've been thinking about some of these changes, and you've heard presentations on them. If there's an interesting article on your field in your area, have that task force, Xerox them, photo duplicate them. Then there's demographics, of course. I mean, one scholar said that demographics is destiny. There might be some truth in that. What are the demographics of the people you're dealing with? And I suspect they are changing. Is your clientele older, getting older? Is it getting younger? Have there been certain ethnic groups or religious groups or cultural groups that have moved into your area now? And are we dealing with them properly, with communication? That is part of scanning the future, is seeing how my patients are changing, how my clients are changing. And I have just done my own scanning for you. Now, this is not just in the field of oral surgery, but rather in healthcare in general. And I'm not going to read down the list, but there's some things you might want to think about that are happening throughout healthcare now, big data, 3D printing, population health management, that you might want to keep your eye on in the future. Okay. Now, number 2, getting buy-in for the change. Well, first you have to overcome complacency. People have been inundated with change, and they've gotten a little bit cynical about it. Oh, yeah, this is the change du jour. Don't worry, the boss will forget about it. Well, you have to overcome that complacency, and I think one way of doing that is to strike hard at what are the advantages of what we're doing, what are the benefits of what we're doing, and try to communicate that to them. And if you can take your change and somehow relate it to the mission or the vision of your organization, it even gets more staying power that way. So let's say you're making a change that is going to improve patient satisfaction, and you might be able to say, well, this is to someone, this is going to improve patient satisfaction, and so let's do it, for that reason. That is, try to relate the change to something larger, a larger value in the organization. And then there's getting buy-in. Now, there are a couple of ways of getting buy-in. First is through data, observations, fiscal data, clinical outcomes data, whatever the data is that you want to use. That's always good to start with. And docs and the people who work in medical practices like data. That's good as far as it goes, but let me suggest, if you can add to it, to create what psychologists call a felt need. That is, to get people to realize the need for a change, not just intellectually, but on their pulse. To get them to realize the need for a change emotionally. Let me tell you a story that I actually worked with this hospital that did this. There was a floor of a hospital that the patients, in their patient satisfaction forms, were always saying is too noisy. This place is like a train station. I can't sleep a wink all night because of all the noise here. And it's very clear on their patient satisfaction forms the place was noisy. And so the nursing director came to the nurses and said, listen, we're not getting good scores. We're getting an average score of 3 on a 5-point scale. And the nurses became fairly defensive and said, oh, listen, we're no more noisy than any other place I've ever worked in. That's their imagination. Then I think the nursing director did something to create this felt need that I thought was brilliant. She asked each of those nurses, the most vociferous ones, to stay in a room overnight and put a couple of them near the nursing station. Well, she came back the next morning with these bleary-eyed nurses who said, my gosh, this place really is noisy. We didn't realize that. And it's not just us shouting like, we need a pillow in 320, but it's around the nursing stations. They had sort of little social gatherings at night. People were shouting down the hallway, we need a pillow in 220, that sort of thing. And those critics who thought that there wasn't anything wrong with the noise level went to the HR department and asked for a noise awareness week. And the CEO kicked it off, and they made little badges that said "shush, healing going on." But why? And so the very critics became the very leaders of this "let's be more quiet" movement. Why I like that story, though, is that the nursing director had them experience the need for the change, had them feel it on their pulse. And then those people who were the initial critics became the greatest advocates of it. Something else that I've seen hospitals do and dental clinics do, they'll ask some patients who have been dissatisfied to come in and at a meeting talk to the nurses or the staff. And, 99% of nurses and your staffs are great patient advocates, but just didn't realize that certain things weren't happening right. And they had the patients talk about their experience. And, tears came to the eyes of some of the people that I saw there. And doing this creates that internal need for this change. People are feeling this need now in their bones that we should change. And so you might think of doing that if at all you can. And then, of course, communicate widely the benefits of this change, how we're going to improve. And we're still working now on getting buy-in for change. When you have a meeting and you're going to announce a change, the first meeting, I think, should be fairly, generic, maybe, explaining, the whole change from 50,000 feet. But think of some of the points you might want to hit if you have a committee meeting and you're announcing a change to your staff. Well, first of all, why are we doing the change? People aren't stupid. They want to know, what the rationale is. And if you have data, that's fine. What would happen if we didn't do this change? That's sort of an interesting path to go on sometimes. Change involves pain. It involves fiscal pain, personnel pain, supply pain, anxiety pain. Change is accompanied by pain, and that's part of being honest with people to let them know that. But if the pain of not changing is greater, then people will want to change. And that's what you want to do, is to look at, well, if we don't do this change, let's think of how bad this A, B, and C will be. And that is sometimes a way of getting people on board, especially emotionally. How will this change impact me or benefit me? People at this point, you're announcing a change, they're going to be frightened, and they're going to immediately think of their job, which is fine. And how will it impact me? Am I going to be downsized? I guess that's their ultimate question. And how will this impact my team? And those are some of the issues that I think you should talk about at that first meeting. Then communicate often. And the first three rules of real estate are communicate, communicate, communicate. The first three rules of change leadership are communicate, communicate, communicate. See, the leadership of real estate people, it's location, location, location. I misspoken. And then for you folks, it's communicate, communicate, communicate. It's a process. It's not just one event. And communicate whenever you feel that you should communicate. If people are having trouble, remind them why they're doing this. And go over the why. People aren't stupid. They're going to want to know why we are doing this change. And in particular, how's it going to benefit me? And I would say just communicate over and over. And the best type of communication is face-to-face talks. Email is, I love email, we all love email, we couldn't live without email, but email is not the best way to lead a change. It is going to the employees, looking them in the face and talking to them. I know this takes time, but again, it's well worth it. Now, when you start to talk to an employee and you do a little bit of wheel spinning first, then the employee will say, well, do you know about this change? Have you thought of this or have you thought of that? And again, your employees probably know how to do their jobs better than you do. And, the Japanese have made great progress that way from having, grassroots people make suggestions to leadership. Let them talk about the change and then see if you can tweak it based on what they say. And you're only going to get that, it seems to me, in face-to-face talks. You're probably not going to get that in an email. Or if someone says, there's this part of the change I really dislike, you probably aren't going to get that in an email either. Talking to them, even though it takes time, is a great way to let people know you care and to answer their questions directly and to get them on board. Now, the old rule of communication, tell employees only what they need to know. The new rule is, when in doubt, tell employees too much. Now, we'll go on to planning for change. Now, this is the, we're in our third segment now, and this obviously is a very important segment. Create objectives that are clear, precise, concrete, and measurable. Let me repeat that. Create objectives for the change that are clear, precise, concrete, measurable. I think this is the single, in my opinion, the single most important element in the change process that will make a change work or not work. This one item, clear, precise, measurable, concrete objectives. We sometimes think we have that. We sometimes think, well, we are, giving them a plan with precise objectives, but we really aren't. Let's say that there's a change you want to make, and you talk to the employees, and you say, well, listen, let's really, our patient SAT scores aren't very good, so let's pull together and let's win one for the Gipper. Let's form a team, and let's address, patient needs, and let's show our patients how good we really are. Those are not objectives. Those are platitudes. An objective that will work will be, let's improve pain management by 10% over the next 3 months. See, that is precise, it's concrete, it's measurable. And if you say that to people, a funny thing happens. They won't get those figures out of their mind. They'll be driving home and saying, how can I improve pain management 10%? What can I do to improve it 10% over the next 3 months? That is, I think, the way you want to formulate an objective. And then, very bottom of the screen, build in metrics for evaluation. We're all concerned about ROI and even time. So if that is an issue, start with what things are costing you now or how long something is taking you, and then so you have a baseline to compare it to. Now, increase the skills and knowledge of employees. You don't want to set employees up for failure. They might not have the skills that they need for the change that you want to implement. And you have to teach them those skills then. If it's someone who is going to be working with patients, then make sure this person has great interpersonal skills. If it's something that's technical or communications, make sure that they have those technical or communication skills. And you can do this by training them yourself or by having a consultant come in to do some training or by coaching them yourselves. But the point is you don't want to set up people for failure. You want them to embrace this change. And sometimes they won't embrace the change because they're afraid they just can't. They don't have the knowledge or skills. Give them those skills. And that means that you also have to understand, of course, what level your employees are at. Invite early participation of employees. I think this is vital. It's good operationally, again, because your employees know how to do their jobs probably better than you do. And it's good diplomatically or politically. Somebody asked me for my opinion, and I gave my opinion. So even if things go south, I had my day in court. I was able to talk about this. I mean, invite their participation. You will probably get something very valuable out of that. Then do a stakeholder analysis. And that is for each employee in the department. Let's say you have 10 employees in your department. Or if you're doing this system-wide, let's say you have 10 departments, then I would do a stakeholder analysis for each department. But let's say we're just dealing with one department. On one page for each person, try to analyze how they're going to respond to change. Is this the kind of person who just speeds through it, no problem, or is this the kind of person who just really resents it and fights me all the way? How long has this person been with us? Is this someone who is young and maybe will listen to somebody older in the organization? Okay. Does this person have the skills to do this? What's this person's likely attitude when I announce the change? That is, whatever questions you can ask to better understand how each person who's going to be affected by it will react. And you don't want to be surprised. Then we have an impact analysis, and this is how this change is going to affect the non-human aspects of the organization. How's this going to affect our bottom line? How's this going to affect our plans for the future? How's this going to affect HR? How is this going to affect the community? I know of a couple of hospitals that wanted to remove their burn units, and they thought that, that's fine, it made sense to them, but then there was this hue and outcry from all the young mothers in the community who said, no, don't remove that. So try to analyze how this change is going to affect your cash flow, your budget, all of those items. So we're doing planning for this change. Remember, we don't want to be surprised by anything that happens. Okay. Now, make two types of plan. Now that you've done that, the stakeholder analysis, a content plan is what is the substance of your change, and write it out, point by point. What is it that I want to do? Usually, we in healthcare do pretty well with that. We do our homework. We know what we're doing. That's usually not a problem. Then there's the process plan, the politics of the plan, and that is how do we roll it out. That we are sometimes not very good at. How do I overcome resistance from everyone? Is there somebody in the department who I know is going to resist this, but I can maybe talk to that person ahead of time before the change is ever announced? So you're not going to get, St. Paul on the road to Damascus conversion maybe, but at least the person might hold their criticism off for a while. And if it's a organization-wide change, it could be a department that you think is going to, has always been recalcitrant, and so I'll talk to the department head ahead of time. If this is something that was done at another practice near you, have somebody from there come over to talk to them. That is, you be careful about the process plan and realize that the psychological part is very important. And then there is the what I call the poison pill. Sometimes a change just doesn't work. We always talk about leading changes, though they always work. And you sometimes have then the ego of the change leader, and I don't want to change. I know I'm going to pull the plug on this. I know we'll reach the tipping point if we spend a little more money. Well, I found it easier if in the planning stage where we are now, you put in a kind of poison pill. That is to say, and be very liberal with it. After 2 weeks, if we haven't achieved A, let's really do a thorough going over of why we haven't. And after a month, if we haven't achieved A, B, and C, let's really look at the whole plan again. Let's look at the whole idea again. And, there may be a point at which you say, well, it's just not working. And if you acknowledge that up front in the planning stage, that is, after 2 weeks you want to reach this goal, after a month you want to reach this goal, whatever those dates are, if you acknowledge that up front, it's easier then to disengage from it. Okay, now, let me go on to stage 4. And stage 4 is resistance to change. And, it's in human nature. Why do people resist change? Well, fear of the unknown. I can adjust to something I know, but if it's something I don't know, I'm going to be very fearful. Will this cost me my job? Will this cost me the team that I love to work with? 500 years ago, when cartographers drew maps of the world, in the areas that were unexplored, they drew dragons. There be dragons. They could have drawn, if you think about the metaphor, they could have drawn anything they wanted in those areas. They could have drawn pictures of the king, pictures of angels. But what is the metaphor? If we haven't been there, it must be bad. If we haven't been there, it must be dangerous. And that, I think, is in our DNA, and your employees will feel that same way now. If we haven't been there, wow, this might be hard. I think another reason why people resist change is they just disagree with you. You say this will work, I say it won't work, and you sort of, do that kind of ping pong back and forth. And you just have to ask those people to stay on board to see how this will work out, and of course keeping them information about the change as well. Sometimes people don't want their team broken up. Gee, I love the team I'm working with now this will endanger it. There are all sorts of valid reasons why people resist change without being passive-aggressive. And I think we have to acknowledge that there are reasons why people can resist change. Now, this has been well documented that there's a process people go through when you announce a change to a department or an individual. First stage is denial. Oh, you know, she's running it up the flagpole to see who salutes it. Don't worry, this will be gone in a couple of days. Usually people don't linger in denial too long, but they'll go down to resistance, and there they do stay for a while. That is, you know when it's in the resistance stage and they say things like, I give more than I receive. I give more than I receive. Or my boss doesn't know what a great job I'm doing. Usually there'll be some absenteeism, perhaps. There'll be veiled threats of leaving, which are never followed up on, and just, you know, a general amount of grousing. And I think the two best antidotes to that are patience. You know, let them work this out in their own minds. You know, they're dealing with their emotions now. Patience, and to try to provide some answers to their problems without being defensive if people are in that resistance stage. People will eventually get out of it and go to what I call a new awareness. That is, okay, I'm buying into this now. I'm still not completely sure, but yeah, I'm buying into it. And you know people that are in this stage, because they look like the proverbial chicken with his head cut off. They're going into a million different directions. You know, they're eating lunch at their desks. They're staying an extra hour at night because everything is new that I'm learning. And I'm doing my old job, too. You know, I'm robbing Peter to pay Paul. And this is a difficult spot for people, and they're going to be nervous and antsy. And then finally you get up to commitment. And I'm not talking about compliance now, I'm talking about commitment, that I fully believe that this is a good change. People will go through this, whether you think they are or not, they are. And some people, this is one of the problems, some people will go through it right away. You know, they just get to commitment easily. Others might linger somewhere, let's say in denial or in resistance. And I think you, as a great leader, have to recognize where each employee is and then go, and this is that face-to-face conversation, talk to people about, well, why are you lingering in resistance? Or, you know, have you gotten out of the new awareness stage yet? To talk to them individually, because they don't all move through this at the same pace. And one of the problems is, you know, in the old days, you know, a CEO could say, well, listen, you know, we'll go to a park and we'll go to a retreat and we'll spend the weekend talking about this and straightening out all of our resistance ideas. Well, CEOs don't have the time or money for that now. They'll say, okay, you go from denial to commitment right now, you know, in 1 minute. And I think the problem there is that you know, you can say it, but people aren't going to do it. They're going to take their time. You know, I think of the old Archie Bunker show, All in the Family, which I think was popular in Europe as well as the United States. In one of the episodes, Edith is going through the change of life, and she's just screaming at everybody, screaming at Archie, screaming at her daughter, and then she'll get depressed. You know, and just not talk at all. And she keeps alternating between these two. And finally, Archie is just exasperated, and he looks at his watch and says, Edith, you're going through the change of life, you have 15 minutes. Well, I mean, we can say people have 15 minutes, but that they're going to take their time, and they're going to go through this at their own pace. Now, who are the people who will resist change? Well, those who are highly invested in the current way of doing this thing. I was part of it. You know, I helped formulate this procedure that we're doing. Those who expect more work as a result, and that will probably happen, or those who advocated a different alternative. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why people will resist change. And then how do you get people involved in the change? How do you get them to support the change? Well, first of all, they believe it's the right thing to do. And this is where those face-to-face meetings really come in handy, so you can explain the rationale. They can explain what their misgivings are. And sometimes their misgivings are wonderful, and let's put that into our plan. Or let's assume that other people have that same problem, and we'll put it into our way of overcoming resistance. People see personal and organizational gain from this. So explain that. You know, how you will be working smarter, not necessarily harder, how the organization is going to have a better margin, how we're going to improve patient satisfaction, and then respect for the person leading the effort. And we talked about that before, about honesty and openness. That will cover a multitude of sins. So you give everyone the same version of what's happening. Give people realistic change previews. You know, don't try to blow smoke in their face and saying how easy this is going to be. Change is not easy. Okay, now, some of the ways of overcoming it. First, education. Make sure that people aren't being set up for failure. We go back to our planning stage. What is the educational level? Do we have to improve that in some way? And keep the communication open, as we've already said. You really can't communicate too much. Their involvement. I want to involve their ideas because, again, they probably know parts of their job better than you do, and they probably have great ideas. Communication is a two-way street. Listening to their concerns, and don't assume they're being passive-aggressive. They have legitimate concerns. Maybe I can't learn this new software. Maybe I can't do this new technique. And structural change. Structural change is this. It's a let's say, psychological way of changing. It is you as Attila the Hun who says, we're changing. We're doing this, end of discussion. Let me give you, sometimes that's called for. So, let me give you an example. At Ohio State University, we have about a dozen medical buildings, large buildings around, 3 large quadrangles that are each the size of a football field, I think. And they're really beautiful. They're all grassy with chairs, and in the spring, the place is enlivened with flowers, and patients and their families sit there. It's really a very bucolic spot. The only problem is this is where employees take their smoking break, and so you used to have to walk through a blue cloud to get across the quadrangle, which is kind of ironic. And so what did the CEO do? Well, he could have said, oh, listen, I'll show you a picture of a diseased lung. I'll tell you all the reasons why smoking is bad. Well, that's silly. Everyone knows smoking is bad. So what he did was just declared on Monday morning, 8 o'clock, no more smoking on campus, end of discussion. Sometimes that works very well. The problem is we're in a touchy-feely culture, however, and so that you can't go to that well too many times, or you'll be looked upon as Attila the Hun. But know that there is a time when that is called for, when it's maybe a bad person job fit. Resistance to change. This is if you have a lot of resistance and you're going to give a presentation. Let me give you this formula from 50,000 feet. A is, when you start, a little bit of dissatisfaction with the status quo. Our patient scores aren't all that great. Our margins aren't all that great. That is, make people feel there is a slight problem there, and then immediately, B is the new benefits. How can we improve this? How can we make this much better than it is? Let's hit them with the outcomes. Then the first step, make the first step small, something that everyone can do. And don't make it hard because that will just intimidate people. And then those 3 items should be greater than the cost to the individual. And there will be a cost to the individual. If nothing else, the individual will be more anxious, maybe lose a little bit of sleep. But I think if you could use that sort of model if you're going to present things to people, to create with a little bit of dissatisfaction, or else why should we change? B, hit hard the benefits, the outcomes. C, that easy first step, and then what will be the cost to you. Now, expect resistance, and let me say this one thing. That I often hear people in healthcare say, well, listen, I understand reality objectively. I look at everything objectively. Let me give you a John Sena quote. No one sees things the way they are. We see things the way we are. And so you can have 2 people who have an honest difference of opinion, and they're not being just hostile to you. We just see the world differently. And if you can use an objective standard, as there are many in healthcare, a protocol, a procedure, you can start with that. Okay, here's the slides on listening, which I'm not going to do because they're fairly self-evident. So let's go to stage 5, which is our stage of implementation. What are some of the impediments? A survey of 90 Fortune 500 companies were taken right after they implemented a change. And this is what people said about what were the problems in implementing the change. First, it took more time than anticipated. I mentioned that earlier. It's just the nature of the beast. Then major problems arose not identified. Well, your stakeholder analysis and impact analysis should have covered that. Coordination of activities not effective. Skills and abilities of employees not sufficient. Well, we talked about that in our plan for change. You got to bring the employees up to speed. Training and instructions of lower level employees not adequate. Well, we talked about that too. Those, essentially from 2 to 5, are all problems with the change leader that if you follow what we've been talking about, our model, they should not occur. Finally, 6 is uncontrollable factors. Well, obviously, we can't control the world. You can have a break in your water main, and that's going to hold things up for a while. Some implementation Principals, senior support. You need somebody who's going to be accountable to this. You have to have senior leadership do more than just an occasional smile, but attend some meetings, communicate constantly, reward the process, not with money, but with a pat on the back or a coupon to Starbucks. Get some quick successes, and when you do get a quick success, celebrate it. Remain flexible. Then path clear. I do want to mention something about that. There are various theories about the change leader, and some theories are, or some models are, well, this is this person who's a dynamic speaker, spellbinding personality, who stands on the ramparts with a flag, waves it, and says, "Follow me." If you can do that, that's fantastic. More power to you. But I think for most of us mere mortals, when we are leading change, think of ourselves as path clearers. That is, my job is to remove obstacles, political obstacles, logistical obstacles, supply obstacles, fiscal obstacles, whatever those obstacles are. I'm going to remove them so that my employees can achieve whatever their talents or abilities will allow them to achieve in this change. That is, I'm the path clearer. And let me say also this. I think the most important single word or question a change leader can ask is, what can I do to help? That's how I envision ourselves. What can I do to help? I have good employees. We've trained them well. Now I want to help them achieve these goals. And when they achieve them, I want to stand in the background and get their reflected glory. And, of course, people will want feedback. Don't hoard the feedback. Let's go on to, this phrase. This comes from the Harvard Business Review. We are much more likely to act our way into a new way of thinking than to think our way into a new way of acting. What it means is that you can get people to do the acts. You can get them to comply. They'll go through the motions, right? But their thinking hasn't caught up to that. That takes a little longer until their thought process gets to the point where, okay, now I know why I'm doing this, and I like why I'm doing this. This is one argument, I guess, for doing change gradually sometimes, incrementally. It gives people more time for their thinking to catch up to their actions. Then let me go to our last section, which is evaluation of the change. And this isn't terribly complicated. There are certain soft objectives. You use a survey instrument. Ask HR to talk about complaints, absenteeism. Is there general griping around the office? Some anecdotal evidence is fine. The problem with anecdotal evidence is, though, you don't want to just listen to one person all the time. Then how do you evaluate maybe the hard objectives? Do a survey again. Look at fiscal data. Are you seeing more patients each day? Are you working smarter rather than harder? Look at HR data. You can issue a questionnaire before and after the change to each employee to get their opinions. I think that would be very interesting. And then there's the anecdotal side of it. What do you hear from talking to people face to face? And again, try not to use emails very much. I mean, I love email. I couldn't live without emails. All of us couldn't live without emails. But for leading change, you really want to get to where the people are and look face to face and talk to them. That's how you find tremendous information. And if there are any questions about this or comments or whatever you want to say, there's my email address. I love hearing from people that I've talked with. I'd like very much to hear from you. And now, Deborah, do we have questions perhaps from the audience?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Sena, and really, really insightful presentation. I would like to open up the last few minutes for questions. There is a question box at the lower left-hand corner of your screen, and you just type your question into the box, and you hit the send button, and we will be able to see your questions. So there is a first question that came in, and we'll go ahead and start with that one, if that's okay. What if it's a member of the leadership team who is not bought into the change? Not an employee, but a member of the leadership team.
Exactly. A wonderful question. Yes. This is what I call support from below. That is, you as an employee or a manager can give support to that leader by talking about the change. by first of all finding out what it is that leader responds to. Does leader respond to fiscal data, HR data, whatever kind of data, and try to make the case using the data by first of all finding out what does he or she respond to, what does he or she look for. And try to give support from below, saying that this is wonderful if we would try this, and let's put our poison pill in. If we haven't achieved something by the end of a week or two, then we'll really either pull a plug on it or change it radically. But I think it's to find out what motivates that person, and then try to, and this includes employees as well, try to formulate the plan in terms of what that person values. And usually you can do that. The person might value, say fiscal data, might value reputation with the community. You can usually manipulate the goal of a change so that it will suit that person. But I think oftentimes we have to give support from below to help even our managers or our leaders understand something perhaps that they didn't understand. And of course to do it very, very diplomatically, and to create that felt need if you can. I mean, what is it that that person responds to? And maybe we can create a felt need by talking about that. Another question, Deborah?
Let's see if we have another question. I don't believe we do at the moment. We do not.
Well, can I say this too about communication?
Of course you may.
Since communication is vital. We know that in the workplace today communication is vital, but when you're leading a change, it is essential. Because no matter how much you communicate, people will think you're holding something back. When you go on the floor and you're talking to someone, okay, about this change, the person is looking at you. How is that person understanding you, what you're saying? And how are you understanding the person who's talking back to you? I don't know if this will surprise you or not, but 55% of a verbal communication like that is based on facial expression and body gestures. There are tiny muscles next to our eyes and mouth that involuntarily tighten when we're tense. What are you doing with your eyes? What are you doing with your arms? Do you have your arms folded? How are you standing? And we have learned from the time we were children how to interpret all this body language and facial expressions. And that, believe it or not, when you're talking to someone, is 55% of the message. Another 30%, so we're up to 85% now, another 30% is your tone of voice. Are you being comic? Are you being tragic? Are you being ironic? Let me give you the same sentence 6 different ways, okay? I didn't say he stole the money. I didn't say he stole the money. Maybe someone else said it. I didn't say he stole the money. I mean, I just sort of implied it. I didn't say he stole the money. I didn't say he stole the money. I didn't say, well, that's it. That's 6 different ways in which one is correct. And if you are using email, this is the limitation of email. You don't get tone of voice in emails. That could be read any one of 6 different ways. And so that's 30% of the communication. The last 15% of how we are communicating in a face-to-face meeting is words. So believe it or not, words aren't the most important part. I'm not saying that you shouldn't watch what you say and be clear about what you say, but it's also other things that people are looking at when you're talking to them on the floor. The facial expressions, your tenseness, your at easeness, body language, tone of voice, those are all very important when we're talking to people and when they're trying to understand what we're really saying, what that 15% is saying.
Great. Thank you, John. I think we are just about at time here, and we do not have any questions, but you have a lot of nice comments of people saying they really enjoyed the program. Oh, one person did ask, what is the difference between knowledge and believe in making change? Knowledge and maybe belief.
Right. Yeah, there is a bit, these questions, by the way, are wonderful. You're obviously very sophisticated leaders in your own right. We all understand things intellectually. I mean, I can show you, a medical chart. We can understand intellectually what is going on with the patient. I can show you X-rays of your molars, and we can see a tooth transplant. That's knowledge. It's factual. It's data. Beliefs are more personal. And that's where, again, the successful change leader wants to work on that emotional level too. That the data is easy. I can give you the data, but what do I want you to do with that data? And that's where you can try to make personal arguments, arguments from your experience, arguments from patients that you've taken care of. But there is a big difference there. And, knowledge just goes so far, frankly. I think real great leaders are able to have their constituents believe in them, believe in what they're saying, understand that, this is the right thing, and, play the devil's advocate, say all the things that could go wrong, but listen, we still should be doing it. And that's where you get that, what I mentioned before, honesty and integrity of the person doing the change. Believe me, that goes a long way. If parts of a change start to go south, and that very well could happen, if they believe in you, believe in your integrity, that you say what you mean and you mean what you say, that will cover that multitude of sins, and they will go on believing in you and believing in the change.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sena. We are going to go ahead and conclude our webinar today, but I think it was just packed with great ideas, and we're seeing a lot of really great comments on the in the question box. So thank you so much for your time with us today. So on behalf of IAOMS, thank you so much for visiting. Again, if you are not currently a member and you'd like to become a member, visit IAOMS.org, and please complete the program evaluation that you will receive shortly. Sandy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Deborah. And with that, we will conclude today's program. As Deborah mentioned, please click on the webcast evaluation link in the links box on the left side of your screen. Your feedback is very important to us. This session has been recorded and will be available within 7 business days. You may access the recorded archive on the IAOMS website. On behalf of the International Association of Oral and Maxillofacial Surgeons, thank you to our speaker today, and of course thank you to all of today's participants. Have a good day, and you may now disconnect.